Hi, folks. Welcome back. This today's material is going to be short. We are wrapping things up, and I want to give you plenty of time to finish your live music papers, your research paper, things of that nature. So today's material is pretty short. In fact, there are no Ken Burns clips to watch. This is really kind of just a thing about where jazz went during sort of the rise or the height of jazz fusion, when you had groups like Weather Report or the Headhunters or a Return to Forever, Miles Davis and whatnot. When they were sort of getting all the attention, where did the more traditional musicians go? And what has happened to jazz now that we are very much in the rock and roll era, 60s into the 70s, pop music, all over the airwaves, and jazz is not making any headway, not really selling a lot of records. Okay. Well, so again, if you were not involved in the fusion game, what did you do? A lot of clubs were closing. There weren't places to play jazz. Traditionally, there wasn't an audience to come to jazz to come listen to jazz to keep these sort of clubs alive and well, on 52nd Street, the Five Spot, Birdland. These well-known places. So what actually happened in the 70s is this, and again, this comes from the liner notes of a CD, or of a 5-album set that was released, called Wildflowers: The New York Loft Jazz Sessions. It's actually this right here. It's kind of a really interesting record, or group of records. And it says that musicians and artists moved into, quote, neglected warehouses, commercial offices, small manufacturing plants, and storefronts in Soho and NoHo. That's South Hudson and North Hudson, the Hudson River. That was a very industrial part of town. In the early 20th century, there was a lot of manufacturing there, textiles, I believe, in particular. As those plants closed, the warehouses and commercial offices and whatever were abandoned and just neglected, basically. So now in this era, Soho and NoHo is prime real estate property. But in the 1970s, it was all run down, old stuff. So musicians and artists actually sort of moved in to these neglected buildings, kind of like as squatters in a sense, and they took them over. And then they renovated them. They turned them into living spaces, and they turned them into like art galleries, or workspaces for them to do their work. Or in the case of what we're talking about, jazz, they turned them into studio spaces where they would perform and sometimes record. These artists toiled to turn raw interiors, basic plumbing, high ceilings, and atypical amenities into gardens of urban culture. Their plan was to run galleries, recording and rehearsal studios, and new performance venues in their living rooms. So if there isn't a club to play jazz at, we're just going to make our own venue, and invite people to come and check it out. And that's really basically what would happen here in the 70s. As all the jazz clubs closed, and as all the jazz fusion artists were playing to bigger, larger venues and the younger, hipper audience, this is what happened. This is a advertisement from the Village Voice in 1976, advertising the Spring Music Festival. These are jazz concerts. Studio Rivby was, which I'll explain for you in a minute, was actually the loft home area of Sam Rivers and his wife B. So that's where Rivby comes from. Rivers and his wife, his name was B. So over 2 weekends in 1976, they had these artists playing concerts in their home, in a sense, in their loft in Studio Rivby. And these are the folks. And then here is a map of Manhattan Island. And I guess I should clarify, not all of these happened in in Studio Rivby, because these little dots here with numbers on them, these were the locations of these concerts on the given days, I guess. There's something on the other page here that must have helped out as well. Okay, but this is kind of how it was, and it was this weekend, these 2 weekends, middle of May, these 2 weekends in the middle of May of 1976. That's where they got all of the concert footage for the Wildflowers album set. It was a 5 album set. It fits on 3 CDs, but that's the information that they have there. You got, let's see, you got David Murray, Con Jamal, Sam Rivers, Jerome Hunter, Art Bennett, Ken McIntyre, Anthony Braxton, Leo Smith, Randy Weston, all kinds of people that weren't working in fusion groups. A lot of their music is sort of experimental, in many ways avant-garde, but the scene wasn't there for them to play anywhere else. So this is kind of what happened. It was called the Loft scene, and they just got pushed into these other areas. Like I said, Rivby was run by the multi-instrumentalist Sam Rivers. He played all the saxophones, all the woodwind instruments, and his wife Bee. And it was this Wildflower set that was recorded there. And there were dozens of other locations. This is just what would happen. And they would open their doors, oftentimes to free concerts, or I've read stories about how there would be like potluck dinners, like bring some food to share, right? And then there'll be a concert that evening. It was very much sort of communal, and it's what these people did to sort of keep the music alive while there wasn't much of an audience for it. Pop music in the 70s again was doing lots of other things. So this is kind of where jazz was. It was very much on life support during this time, and that is basically what was going on. All right. So other things I want to talk about as jazz is sort of dying during this era. It'll come back, but it's definitely, like I said, on life support. Is after the big band era, after the swing era, when that was unquestionably when jazz was its most popular. It was pretty much the soundtrack of World War II and the country's patriotic efforts and all that kind of stuff. But after we spoke about this before, after World War II, a lot of big bands went away because the music started to change, went in the bebop direction and got a lot more complicated. There were various strikes or labor issues that drove many bands sort of off the road or musicians out of the business. And of course, styles change, popular tastes change, right? So a lot of that stuff went away and was replaced by other things. You also got the rise of sort of rhythm and blues, country and western, eventually rock and roll and that kind of stuff. There were big bands that did continue, however. And there are modern day big bands that are still around doing big band stuff, but they're certainly not doing the old-fashioned big band music of yesteryear. They're using the big band as their vehicle for new, innovative music. I'm going to upload a bunch of things for you if you want to give them a listen. There's some fantastic music out there, played by incredible musicians and written by amazing composers that you just don't really hear because it's not going to be played on the radio, and unless you know where to go and get it, right? This is, again, part of the process of your second research paper is I'm asking you to do some research and invest some time in a new jazz artist, right? That's kind of where we're going to go with some of this stuff here. So immediately sort of after the swing era, you had some leftover things. You'd have what were known as legacy bands, or as people, as the original artist would sort of pass away, they'd be known as ghost bands. These groups, more often than not, perform the old standards, right? It's the legacy music. So even when they write new music, it's kind of in an older style, right? So there's a Glenn Miller band, like I mentioned before, that still tours playing the classics of Glenn Miller. It's not the United States Air Force Airmen of Note, which is very much a modern day big band. There is a Glenn Miller orchestra that still tours. There was a Tommy Dorsey orchestra that would still tour every once in a while, playing the classic Tommy Dorsey hits. The Count Basie band to this day still goes out every couple of years. Somebody has all of the music, somewhere. And every couple of years, they assemble a band and they go out and they play sort of classic Basie things, right? Even though Basie's band lasted well into the 60s, and by now there's been plenty of time, so it comes back as sort of a legacy band, and that will happen, right? But they're again playing more old-fashioned music, right? There were also bands that right after the swing era and after most of those pop bands went away, sort of acted as sort of a transition. How did we get from the late 40s to, the 80s in a sense, in the big band world? Well, Duke Ellington's band continued until the 70s, into the early 70s when Duke Ellington passed away. And then for a while, the group was still led by his son Mercer Ellington. But then eventually that group ceased to exist. As I mentioned, the Count Basie band would continue to innovate, and with its great improvisational background and skill set, that band was loved all the way through the 60s. Woody Herman was a clarinet player during the swing era, but his band evolved and changed a little bit. So he was able to sort of work in other idioms like bebop and like other challenging things, and had some very talented musicians. So he was able to keep a band on the road. Stan Kenton's band was often categorized as like a West Coast cool big band, although the music they played was not necessarily relaxed and mellow like cool jazz. It was oftentimes very explosive, but it was pretty popular stuff. It came about around the same time. It was a white group, mostly white musicians. Stan Kenton was white, so it has those connections to it. I'll upload a little Stan Kenton, just so you can kind of check out the transition. Maynard Ferguson was the lead trumpet player in Stan Kenton's band early on. Made a name for himself as sort of being the guy that could play higher and louder than anybody else. And so he started a band that was quite popular among certain circles, trumpet players in particular. But that lasted for quite a while. Harry James was the trumpet player in Benny Goodman's band. In fact, Harry James is the band that Frank Sinatra got started in. But then again, he would sort of evolve and change with the times, and there would be bands that would his band would continue to sort of, do different things that allowed them to continue afterwards. And then the Buddy Rich big band. Buddy Rich was a drummer that started in the swing era. He played with Tommy Dorsey. He played with groups like that. He was in the Tommy Dorsey band when Frank Sinatra was in the Tommy Dorsey band, for example. But then he went out, and after the swing era ended, after a few years, he started his own band, which is very much drum set driven. He was the showcase performer. But Buddy Rich was wildly popular in some circles. He actually would appear on Johnny Carson's show. Oftentimes he'd appear on talk shows. This may not mean much to you, but when I was a kid, there was a show called The Muppet Show, Jim Henson's Muppets, and they had a weekly show with celebrity sort of guests. Buddy Rich was actually a celebrity guest on The Muppets, which is this is the late 70s. But it's unusual to think, that somebody in his position would be popular enough to be sort of on a show like that, right? And again, I'll upload a couple of things just so you'll hear, give you some examples of some of this transition music. The Buddy Rich big band played a lot of sort of poppy tunes in a big band way. For example, they did a rendition of the Beatles' Norwegian Wood for big band, for example. So the Beatles are popular. Let's just do sort of a Beatle type tune, right? So these are bands that fill in the gaps until you get to a point where bands start to almost have a resurgence. For example, in the very late 60s, two well-known jazz musicians from that era, Mel Lewis and Thad Jones. Mel Lewis was a drummer. He was actually the drummer for Stan Kenton's big band for years. And then the trumpet player, Thad Jones, who had played in Count Basie's orchestra and I believe spent a little time in Duke Ellington's orchestra as well. They got together and they created the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Big Band. And at the time, it was New York City. At the time, late '60s, everybody said, "Why are you doing this? This isn't going to work." Thad Jones had written a lot of arrangements for Count Basie's band, but Basie wouldn't play them because they're great tunes, but they were a little too out. They were a little too not Count Basie. Too much of Thad Jones's voice and not enough of the Basie band voice is, I guess, is how I would describe it. So Thad Jones had a bunch of arrangements. He had a bunch of tunes that he had written. So they put a band together to play this music, and they got together one night in this club in New York City, and at the Village Vanguard, it may have been actually. And people thought, "You're crazy. You're never gonna. No one wants to hear big bands anymore. Whatever." It actually became really popular, and again, relatively, it wasn't Beatles level popular, but it became quite popular that they had a standing gig in the Village Vanguard every week, like every Monday night. The Thad Jones Mel Lewis Band would play there. They made a bunch of records. They toured around. It actually became quite a thing. Eventually, Thad Jones left the band, went to Denmark, where he started working with European jazz musicians. Mel Lewis continued the band as the Mel Lewis Jazz Orchestra. Mel Lewis passed away at some point, and now it still exists. It's called the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra because it plays at the Village Vanguard. They still make records. I'll upload actually a Thad Jones tune recorded by the Village Vanguard Orchestra. They're still doing it now, and if you're in New York City and you want to check it out, find the Village Vanguard, figure out what night they're playing, and go see them. They're there. They're still doing this kind of stuff, right? Although to a much smaller audience, but it's still enough to keep the lights on, which is nice. The Maria Schneider Orchestra, this particular orchestra wins like Grammy Awards and jazz publication polls all the time. Maria Schneider is a composer. She's originally actually from this small town in Minnesota called Wilmer. She moved to New York to learn how to work with Gil Evans, actually at the time in what must have been in the 70s. And she started her own band and has been very, very successful writing music. Her group has maybe 6 CDs that, again, to a smaller audience, but are very well received. I'm going to upload actually a tune from her most recent recording, one called The Thompson Fields. Looks like this. There she is. That's Maria Schneider, Thompson Fields. It's a great album. I don't mean to plug anything, but it's really an outstanding record. The Dave Holland Big Band. Dave Holland played bass on the Miles Davis fusion records. Dave Holland was the electric bass player on Bitches Brew, for example, and some of those other records. He later started a big band. Really great, fun music. Again, stuff that people don't usually hear. There's a big band dedicated to playing the music of Charles Mingus. The Mingus Big Band was sort of a legacy started by Charlie Mingus's widow, Sue. They play weekly in New York. They make records. They've won Grammy Awards, all kinds of stuff. The Clayton Hamilton Jazz Orchestra is based in Los Angeles. They're sort of more of a traditional group, but they're very well received. And there are other groups like that as well. There are just countless other bands that are still kind of doing this sort of stuff. They don't make really, a tremendous amount of records. They don't go on massive tours. The audience isn't that big, but there is still very much an audience for this stuff. If you guys are fans of the Incredibles soundtracks, for example, that music is played by not the Clayton Hamilton Jazz Orchestra. It's played by a similar group, but these guys are studio musicians by day, and then they play in big bands to kind of keep having fun and keep their chops up and all that kind of stuff by night. So this is kind of what's happened to the big band scene. Again, I'm going to upload a whole bunch of selections for you to check out, both sort of old and new, some Stan Kentons and whatever, but also some Dave Hollands. And so just kind of see what you think about this. You might get turned on to something and and might chase some of this other music down. Again, Maria Schneider, I'm a big fan of. Dave Holland, that big band is killer. They just play some amazing stuff. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to fill in some of the gaps here before we introduce jazz is going to become popular again in our next next YouTube lecture, sort of chronologically. It starts. There's rumblings in the late '60s. It kind of starts in the '70s. There is some jazz that a certain type of jazz that becomes popular, and then we'll sort of have a rebirth after that, and then we'll be done with our material. So, with that in mind, you guys have a wonderful afternoon. All right. Go listen to all those cool examples, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.